individual. But let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Rick Cates. I am one of the hosts of the Mobile Hunter podcast, along with Jacob Sklinner, Christopher Leppert, and Josh Luck. Just for your guys' reference, on your seat there's a sticker, and on the back of that sticker there's a QR code. All of these seminars from this weekend will be posted within the next month on the Mobile Hunter podcast. So if you go and you download the podcast to stream or wherever you like to go do that at, every one of our podcasts that we're doing here, every one of our seminars will be on there. So without further ado, I would like to have Mr. Zach Kaiser introduce himself. Zach, give us a little bit about your background, information about yourself, and just who you are as an individual.
So, like you said, my name is Zach Kaiser. I am from Central Ohio. Um, for the last, well, my career is I'm a respiratory therapist, an in-hospital respiratory therapist. I cover all the way from beginning of life to end of life, whether it's babies and C-sections to ICUs to med-surg floors to we have a hospice wing at our hospital that we have to go in and out of occasionally. So ventilators, lungs, hearts, um, just basically the cardiopulmonary system in general is where I spend most of my time dabbling.
Yeah, and to give a little bit of a brag about you quick so you don't have to do it yourself. You guys don't know Zach. Zach has had quite the resume. He's a very, very seasoned hunter. And because of his profession, he's kind of an expert in this field that we're talking about. And he has a lot of experience to prove it in the field. He's killed two booners. That includes one buck over 190. And he's got 17 bucks over 140. And the vast majority of these deer he's watched die in sight. And he has very strategic protocols that are replicated within his job, actually. For how he aims, how he impacts the deer, and everything like that. So not only is he really good at getting on very big bucks, but he's pretty dang efficient at killing them. Which leads into, I guess, the meat and potatoes of this right away. You don't really like to beat around the bush, so we won't
No,
do it either.
no,
um,
no. And I'll tell you this: everything I'm going to say is very straightforward. I have no issue if anybody has any challenges or questions or wants to know why I think and do the stuff that I do. Um, because everything that I do is for a reason. And the reason has been duplicated over and over and over and it works every time. So
yeah, absolutely. And you see the way that people die or live
right.
in your work too. So it's more of a factual rather than anecdotal because we all have that story of the exception or the story of what we're used to, and these are things that are the difference between someone living and dying, and you're very familiar with it. So that's the reason you're so black and white and you're willing to give a fact on it is because it's most of your information here or all of your information here is based on not just your experience but more so the facts that you've gained through studying and actual medical practice,
Right.
which you did point out to us earlier that you are practicing actually. And
Yeah, I am a practicing respiratory therapist. I don't sell DME equipment on the side. So
yes, exactly. So the first thing we want to touch on is where you choose to shoot a deer, and this is not from the perspective of where you aim. This is where do you want your arrow impacting that deer, both anatomically, and we'll just say if we're giving a if you guys are imagining an arrow impacting, we're going to call it a perfect broadside shot on a level path. Okay, so where is your ideal point to hit a deer, both anatomically and where your arrow's hitting?
so if I'm standing, if we're going to talk about an eye level deer, because obviously everything changes rather significantly once you start adding elevation and up or down if you're a mountain hunter and you're shooting upwards. But there's been a real big push lately that if you shoot a deer in the lungs or the back of the lungs, well, that's not optimal. Everyone's worried about vital vein and hitting the heart or cutting the arteries and the veins going off the top of the heart. And if you don't do that, well, you risk getting yourself into a situation that's not good. I mean, I'll live and die by this every day, all day. You shoot a deer in the center of the lungs, not even in the center of the lungs. You shoot them in the back of the lungs, the top of the lungs, front of the lungs, they will die every time. You hit both lungs, you're killing that deer. I mean, there's a tangent that a person could go on, and there's a big argument as to whether or not a deer can live on one lung. Well, I can tell you as a matter of fact, a deer absolutely can live on one lung. I've gutted deer for friends. I've physically seen it myself where a deer got shot and for whatever reason the penetration wasn't there or the angle was wrong and the deer was hit in one lung and they will live. It's 100% fact. They will live. I'm not saying every time they'll live, but it is a possibility. And I think it's a higher possibility that they'll live with a one lung hit than they won't live. It does happen a lot.
Yeah, and even before we were talking too, and you pointed out like I guess a lot of people have the anecdote, the data that they've seen a deer live on one lung and stuff like that. But
Mhm.
but you know, you actually understand the volume of air going into a deer and what's needed to sustain its life, and
Right.
one lung is more than enough to do that in many cases.
Right. So what happens is, and we're going to touch into this later, so I'm not going to really dive into this right now, but you have to think of the lungs as uh two separate entities because while they do work together, a deer can live with one lung. So the thought process is if I'm going to shoot a deer, my goal is to make sure that both holes go through both lungs. You know what I mean? I want to hit one lung and I want to hit the other lung. And obviously it's a game of angles. So if you got a deer and and everybody knows quartering to, quartering away where you're supposed to hit, well, at some point you might make a mistake and maybe misjudge the angle of the deer. So as hunters, our job is to be very analytical before we take that shot to make sure that the deer is standing the way that we believe it is. Because I've done it. I've done it a lot in my younger years, and I'm teaching my daughter now the game and understanding of where she wants her arrow to hit and where she wants her arrow to exit. And she's 10, but I've got her to the point now where she picks up on stuff that I'm 99% positive most adults who've been hunting their whole life don't pick up on. And it's to a fault almost because I'll tell her, okay, shoot or whatever. I'm in the tree stand above her and it's seconds, 3, 4, 5 seconds. And then she'll shoot. And I said, what were you waiting on? She goes, I was just making sure he was standing where he was supposed to. So it's very imperative understanding where the lungs sit and how far back you truly do have in your where you're going to hit a set of lungs. So
Yeah, absolutely. And so I mean we can dive a little bit and we'll talk about what you're referring to with pleural pressure, lung pressure, stuff like that. But just before that, we want to kind of establish what the mechanics of death of a lung shot is. And kind of that, and then if we can touch on ideally what you're looking for, if you're looking for, you know, we talked about two holes like a pass through.
right.
First we'll talk about, you know, what are the mechanics? How does a deer die from a lung shot?
All right. So there's basically two ways that we all die. Animals, all organ, all living, breathing animals. You die from blood loss, or you die from asphyxiation. So you get into shooting a deer in the lungs. Well, you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. You're minimizing their ability to breathe, but you're also causing blood loss. And and in turn, as you're losing blood, you're also inhibiting breathing because it's suffocating them. I mean, it's basically drowning them in blood. And that's why where I shoot a deer in the lungs versus where I think a lot of people, other people want to shoot deer, I try to shoot a deer as high in the lungs as I possibly can because I'm getting the best of both worlds. I'm getting blood loss and I'm getting asphyxiation. Because if the hole's higher, the blood's going down, it's pooling, and it's rendering the rest of the lungs pretty much useless. You can get into the conversation of pneumothorax versus hemothorax. Well, and anytime you shoot a deer, yeah, it's technically a pneumothorax because you're puncturing the pleural cavity that contains the lungs and the pressure, but there's an arrow going through them. So you're inducing blood loss. So it's automatically now a hemothorax. It's not just a pneumo. I mean, it's a hemothorax because you have blood involved. And a hemothorax is whenever you get blood in between the two pleural membranes that encapsulate the lungs. So, again, like I said, it's a two-step process. It's one, but it's technically not one. It's both. So,
So you touched on their pleural cavity and things like that,
Mhm.
and your pleural membrane. Kind of describe the difference between atmospheric pressure, so the atmospheric pressure around us, pleural pressure and lung pressure, and how that impacts the death of a deer.
Okay. So first, let's understand how the lungs sit in the deer. Our lungs, if we stand up, our lungs are top to bottom. Okay. On your right lung, you have 3 lobes. On your left lung, you have 2 technical lobes and a lobe called a lingula. And the reason why that lobe is there is because your heart sits on that side. And so there's not room for a middle lobe. So it's technically a lingula. It's like a little odd shaped thing. I mean, it's not very big. So inside your chest cavity, you have 2 membranes. You have a visceral pleura and a parietal pleura. Your visceral pleura is the membrane that goes around your lungs. You cut open a deer, everybody's gutted a deer, everyone's looked inside of a deer. Do you see membranes? Like, can you physically see them? It's hard to say, oh, there it is. You can't do it because they're so small and they're so minute, but they serve a purpose. So your visceral pleura is the sac that contains your lungs, each lung. And then you have a parietal pleura, which is that membrane that you see on the inside of the rib cage. I'm sure if anybody barbecues ribs, you know how you have to peel that membrane off the back? That's your parietal pleura. That's it. When inflated, when everything's pressurized, those 2 membranes sit side by side. And then I'm sure somebody's heard of somebody along the way who's had pleurisy. Well, pleurisy is not really a diagnosable thing. It's just something that they say when they can't figure out anything else. That's when you get movement between the 2 membranes. So it causes an irritation. So whenever you have these lungs and they're fully inflated, there is no room inside the chest cavity. Lungs don't go big, go small, go big, go small. They go forward and back almost. That's the best way I can describe it. Your diaphragm pulls back on inhalation, pushes forward on exhalation. The pressure inside the pleural cavity, so inside your ribs, not inside your lungs, inside your ribs, is usually about -3 to -5 centimeters of water pressure. We measure pressures in lungs and pleural cavities in centimeters of water pressure. Now remember that because we're going to get back to that. Inside the lung, actually inside, because mind you, the chest cavity is negative pressure. Inside the lungs, you have to have positive pressure because that's what keeps the airways open and allows the exchange of air to go to the lungs. That is called an intrinsic PEEP. That is 5. It is positive 5 centimeters of water pressure. So what happens is, if you think of atmospheric pressure, no one ever talks about atmospheric pressure in centimeters of water pressure. They talk about it in millimeters of mercury, or if you're talking about barometric pressure, that is inches of mercury, not centimeters, or not millimeters of mercury, inches of mercury. So if you're watching the barometer, it's in INHG. That's inches of mercury. It's a large number. That's why they do it, so that you can break it down in a smaller number with a larger scale. So atmospheric pressure is approximately 1,033, 1,034 centimeters of water pressure. So if our chest cavity pressure is -5 at relaxation, and you have a positive of 133, what's the first thing that's going to happen as soon as that cavity's punctured? All that air goes in, and it's so fast. It's I mean, it's a millisecond. And if you shoot a deer in the lungs, that pop you hear, that's that pressure barrier being broke. That's not a lung popping. That's the pressure, the big pressure change that when it snaps. So the change in pressure pushes the lungs and it compresses them. And when we get into shot placement, you'll kind of understand why I shoot them back in the lungs versus tight in the shoulder. And it's a layer thing. That hole doesn't close. You shoot a deer in the lungs where the shoulder isn't, where there isn't 3 layers, there's nothing to close. I mean, you might get some skin slip, but at that point, it's a sucking chest wound, and you're not changing pressures at that point. It's atmospheric, and it's just not sustainable to life if you have 2 lungs that are punctured.
So then I've got a question then. So there's and I'm sure you've heard of it. I think everybody's heard of it at this point. Putting an arrow in a deer versus a pass through.
Mm-hmm.
What tends to be more ideal? Because we're talking about 3 different types of pressure here, technically 4. What are your thoughts on full pass through versus getting it through both lungs and then burying it in the opposite shoulder or something along
Right.
those lines.
So let's be realistic. Full pass throughs are help us beat our chest. I don't care if I get a full pass through. If it stopped, it's because I hit the opposite shoulder. Is that deer going to die any quicker or any less quick? Absolutely not. It's going the same way. The damage is done. Now, I understand if you're shooting a small cut on contact broadhead versus a large broadhead, you might not get what would be considered an optimal blood trail if you don't get a pass through. I get that. I completely understand. But people want to bring up the Ashby report and Ashby information and whatnot. So in the Ashby report, they talked about you want to pass through because you don't want an arrow that's going to plug a hole. Well, I'm not a mathematician, nor am I a scientist, but I can tell you that a 2-inch hole is not getting plugged by a 5 millimeter arrow in no world ever. And then I get a lot of arguments from people saying, well, in the military, if someone gets impaled, we leave it in until we get to where we can take them to the hospital and they can be taken care of. Then we pull it out, because once you pull it out, then you have more blood loss. Well, when they're getting impaled by stuff and that's happening, it's a rod. It doesn't have a bigger end on it at one end, because if it did, they would never get to the hospital. It's just science. I mean, you can't argue blood loss being plugged. I mean, if I take a basketball and I drill a 4-inch hole in it and you shove your finger in it, is that going to keep the air from coming out? No, it's not. It's just physics, science. So
And that makes sense too when we're talking about when you're talking about essentially equilibrium. Like
Mhm.
the atmosphere and the lungs are reaching the same pressure. You're reaching
Right.
that equilibrium, and it makes sense when you're talking about backing off of that shoulder. You think about a lot of times when it is plugged, it's often by an external member like a arm or a lot of the meat on the outside and other things like that.
And that's exactly right. When you have a deer that you shoot in the shoulder, think about how many layers there are. If the shoulder's forward when you shoot, then the deer comes back. Only a small fraction of the time is that hole exposed. And even then, even if it does get exposed, it might not, because you have membranes, you have other tissues, you have the inside of the shoulder, the outside of the shoulder, you have muscles, you have a scapula, you have everything that's constantly closing that hole. Well, if it's this far behind the shoulder, or anywhere from 2 to 4, 6 inch, 8 inches behind the shoulder, there's nothing to cover it. It's open.
And so it sounds like you're backing off that vital V a good amount. Kind of quantify, like, so we got you got the V, right? And you got kind of essentially where that leg comes up. How far off are you backing off of that back, or what do you look at, I guess?
So I have a formula, and it's not rocket science. If I have a deer sub 20, sub 25 yards, I have no problem hugging that shoulder as tight as I can, because anything that's going to stop an arrow is in where the humerus comes up, meets the scapula, and it's mainly that knuckle where those two join. Well, that's kind of in the front of the shoulder anyway. So the vital V that they talk about is in that V. It's in that triangle. Well, there's no bone there. You know what I mean? You may have depending on how the legs tilted with the scapula, but if they're sub 25 yards, sub 20 yards, I'll hug that shoulder all day long. I don't care. They're not going to move. I'm not going to miss. I mean, if I miss, I did something really stupid. But you start getting into deer that are 30 yards, and I truly believe just over the years that 30 to 34, 30 to 33 yards is the worst distance in the world to shoot a deer. And I think it's that perfect combination of the sound of your bow and their reaction time. I've seen more deer duck at 30 yards than I've ever seen duck at 40, 50, and inversely 15 yards. It just it I will tell you, I don't like shooting deer at 30 to 32 yards. And whenever I start getting in that 30-yard range, I just keep going further back. Because if you think about it, if you watch a lot of videos, when a deer ducks, how's it ducking? It's usually using some sort of momentum. So everyone's seen what was it that Dr. Deer, James Kroll did the video with the deer. They were debating head down versus head up. So it's just physics. When a deer's head is down and it has that momentum to swing its head up, it can and it will drop faster. So I tell people, I would rather have a deer. I'd rather stop a deer and have it alert looking directly at me than shoot a deer with its head down every day, all day. Um, but also, when you think about this, the closer you get to the shoulder, the lower the spine gets. The spine does not go in a perfect parallel straight line. As it gets closer to the shoulder, it dips. And so what happens is the further you are to that shoulder, if you are getting any sort of ducking, that's where they duck. I'm not saying a deer ducks every time because I've seen videos of deer that just flatten, and I don't know how they do it. I think they're double jointed or something because it's pretty crazy how they can do it. But most deer, when they duck, they drop at the front, and there's a constant in the middle. It moves a little, but it doesn't move as drastically as the front. So my thought process is I'll shoot a deer in the middle, as in back of the lungs, because that margin for error is much larger than it is if I'm shooting up front. And what happens is, and everybody's heard of it, no man's land. No man's land. Well, I'm here to tell you right now, it doesn't exist. It's not anatomically possible. There is no gap inside the chest cavity of a deer that's not occupied. It's not physically possible. What people are doing is they're shooting above the lungs. Well, next time you butcher a deer or you're around a deer, in the middle of the deer, you might get 3, 4, 5 inches. You go from the shoulder, directly above the shoulder, and go from the spine to the top of the deer. I mean, a big mature deer, you can have 10 inches. That's no man's land. That's the void. They're shooting above the lungs. And that's what's getting deemed as no man's land. So, or they're shooting the deer and hitting one lung and not getting the penetration or the angle that they thought, and the deer lived on one lung. I mean, I could understand that argument, absolutely. So,
There's a little more anatomy we're going to get to with that too, and we're going to get to drops and other things like that, and livers and stuff. But I just want to open up the floor really quick for questions. If anyone has questions, we got a microphone right here. If you put it right up to your chin, it'd be great. I just want to point out sometimes it may be more comfortable to ask a question after the seminar, but the vast majority of people that are going to hear this are going to be listening to a podcast afterwards. And all of them, and all you guys listen to podcasts, I'm sure you're dying to ask just the person talking a question and pick their mind. And this might help someone a lot that's listening and just screaming at their speaker saying, man, just ask this question. Now's your opportunity to really help some other hunters potentially and ask whatever's on your mind. So
Oh, wrong one. If you
Here we go, here we
Richard,
go.
back
Yeah.
there. All right.
Hold it right up, like about that far from me. As far as like, is there too high of a height in a tree for shot placement?
So this is really interesting, and everybody knows who Lee Lakosky is. Lee Lakosky wrote a book, and this was to me, the most interesting thing that he talked about in his book. He noticed that once he started getting over 20 feet, you start having angle issues. Sure. I mean, when I was younger, higher the better. I've shot deer from 40 feet in a tree. It does two things. It dramatically changes an angle, and it's a harder shot. I don't care who you are. You get 40 foot in a tree and you get a deer at 15 yards. Now you're doing math, trying to calculate angles and understand why a deer or where you need to aim. So I think 22 is kind of my max anymore. I've really gravitated towards 18 to 20. And instead of picking a tree that I have to get 28, 30 foot in, I just find a tree that I can. And obviously there's going to be places where you can, especially people from the South who are hunting telephone poles of pine trees and stuff like that. But from what I like to do and what I find best, that works best for me, is that 18 to 22 foot range. The deer I shot last year, if I was 14 foot off the ground, I was lucky. I think I could have fallen out of the tree and been okay. But it was that perfect tree. It was that perfect old style. I'm sure there's some sort of name for it, but the white oak trees that are short, squatty, with like limbs going everywhere. And it was able to afford me the opportunity to only have to sit 13, 14 foot off the ground. And that dramatically does increase your odds of angles. So.
And you talked about hitting one lung versus two lungs. You think about those lungs being narrow on top, your ability to hit both lungs severely decreases.
Correct.
The higher the angle. Now, it can be advantageous for hunting, but makes a big difference on the shot. You had a question?
So if there's no the no man's land doesn't exist, if you puncture that cavity, what's the chances of survival?
So I'm glad you asked that, because I was thinking about this, that I didn't touch on this. Each lung is individually wrapped with its own visceral pleura. Has anybody here ever had a pneumothorax?
Chris, I believe, shot a deer where he didn't even puncture the lungs and ended up killing it.
Right, but I'm talking individually, like as a person. Have you ever been in the hospital and diagnosed with a pneumothorax? Very, very seldom, unless it's some sort of a traumatic experience, people don't have both-sided pneumos. They have a left or a right. So, and you think to yourself, well, how's that possible? Because I'm sure you've opened a deer up, and as soon as you cut the diaphragm, there's not a division between the two lungs. I mean, we have a gap. That gap is called the mediastinum. It's a space, but that mediastinum does not go all the way to the front, all the way to the back, and all the way to the top and bottom, and it does not separate the lungs. It's a space, and within that space, we have our heart, our esophagus, our trachea, abdominal aorta. I mean, the plumbing kind of goes through that, but it does not separate with a barrier. So how's that possible? You know what I mean? And what you're asking. So how's that possible that you can only damage one lung and the other one works fine? Because each lung, remember, as I said, has a visceral pleura around it. You puncture one lung, the other lung's not affected. And the air goes up. Air goes to it's light. It goes to the highest spot. So what's it do? It goes to the top. Well, a deer standing like this, you know, I mean, we stand like this, a deer stands like this. So it goes up. So each lung is individually wrapped with its own pleura. So that's how you can shoot a deer and it can live on one lung because it's got one lung that's functioning. Now I understand. I mean, deer have a lot stronger will to live than we do. I mean, you shoot me in one lung, I'm probably just going to lay down and die. I'm not running anywhere. But in 2014 or 15, I forget, a buddy's dad shot a deer, and I'm always there with them, and they called me, so I go out to gut it for them. Looking at the deer, there was no physical wounds on the deer other than the bullet hole that he shot it with. He shot it with a 45-70. I opened the deer up. I cut the diaphragm. I'm not paying attention. I'm not worried about anything because he shot it with a gun. I shoved my left hand in to go up and grab the trachea to be able to cut it with my knife. And as soon as I got midway through the chest, something cut me. And it was on it would have been the deer's right side because the deer was upside down. And I pulled my hand out and I go, what was that? So I feel it. I'm like, that's an arrow. So I cut the trachea, pulled out. The right lung was shriveled up to the size of a softball. There was 4 inches of arrow and a muzzy broadhead stuck in the right lung. Left lung was perfectly fine. Completely, I mean, undamaged. The right lung shriveled up to the size of a softball. And that's what really opened my eyes and goes, this happens. This happens more than people think. And you hear the conversation from people or the comment, I know I hit that deer perfect. Well, kinda. I mean, you hit it where you were supposed to. You hit it smack dab in the middle of the lung. So consequently, it was interesting. I know who shot the deer because word got out that my buddy's dad shot it. And he told me the deer was shot 2.5 weeks prior. Did not have a visible wound on its body at all. He described the arrow. He described the broadhead to a T. I know he wasn't lying. Then he showed me trail cam pictures of the deer. 2.5 weeks, that deer completely healed over. You couldn't even see a wound. I don't know how he only got a little bit of penetration like that it only hit. I don't know if he hit a limb, if something happened, you know what I mean, that deflected it. But he hit the deer where he was aiming. It just had no power. So
in talking about all this, can you talk a little bit more about when a deer drops and versus yardage and things along those lines?
Right. And like I said earlier, I truly despise shooting a deer between 30 and 35 yards, 30, you know, at 30, 32, 34, because I feel like that is the optimal distance when they start doing some goofy stuff. So like I said, once I have a deer and it's over 30 yards, I'm backing 6 inches off the back of the shoulder. I mean, and I'm trying to think of the last deer that I didn't see fall that I shot there. And it's been years. I mean, they go, I mean, the vast majority of my deer run anywhere from 50 to 100 yards max. I mean, it's devastating. And I just want people to understand that there's nothing wrong with shooting a deer in the lungs. That's the name of the game. It's the biggest target there is. If you're shooting a big mature deer, if you're shooting a deer in Ohio that's 4 or 5 years old, your target is literally this big. I mean, I'm sure you grew up and people talked about if you can hit a paper plate, you can kill a deer. Well, that's where they get that. It's a big area. And I'm not going to focus on shooting an area this, I mean, in a vital V like this, where I have 4 inches, 5 inches before making a mistake, when I can shoot the deer in the back of the lungs or the middle of the lungs, and I have 8 inches to the left. And if you really want to get technical, I've got 12 inches to the right. You know what I mean? So
So you hit a little bit on that, like as the deer gets further away, you're aiming further back for margin of error, and paper plate is assuming that the
you're aiming in the center.
yeah, and it's where you're landing versus the deer's gonna
Right.
move or air resistance, all that stuff.
Right.
But are you aiming lower for the drop? I know you said you don't, but
Yeah.
how do you?
I do not adjust whatsoever for drop. Ever. I mean, I've never. I mean, there's no wood here to knock on because this year this is bound to bite me. There. I've never had a deer drop to the point where it affected the lethality of my shot. And that's why, like I said, in that 30 to 35 yard range is where I feel like it's most crucial, and that's why I kind of aim in the middle. That way, the pivoting point is it's most stable. So I don't really worry about it at all.
So to play on a few of your comments, and I've got a question here, and this kind of goes to a conversation you and I personally had last night. It seems like now there's a misnomer that these deer are bulletproof all of a sudden, and so I'd like to have you maybe address some on shot placement relative to this huge debate on the extreme heavy arrows, the high FOC versus the lower weight. How, in your opinion, does that affect shot placement? And you don't even really have to go down the broadhead type of rabbit hole. I mean, this is a big winding rabbit hole, but I think that now there's just this misnomer that all of a sudden deer are bulletproof. And I know you and I had a lengthy discussion last night, and I think that you can offer a lot of insight, to the crowd on your position on that.
So at the end of the day, it's marketing, hands down, bar none. I don't care what anybody says. Is there anybody here that grew up bow hunting in the 90s? What kind of arrows were you shooting? Easton aluminums, XX78 Super Slams, or XX75 Game Getters? Listen, I grew up in the same area, or in the same era. I was throwing Lincoln logs at deer at 215 feet a second out of a PSE Infinity. I don't want to go back to that game. I know that game. I didn't like that game. And once I started understanding, and if you notice, it made a big shift. So you went from shooting XX78 Super Slams or Lincoln logs at deer, and then all of a sudden in the early 2000s, we went to speed. Everybody's speed. All the bow manufacturers trying to push, get more speed, get more speed, get more speed. Well, then it went the complete opposite way. Then we went from shooting super, super duper heavy arrows to shooting 350 grain arrows or an IBO spec arrow out of a hunting bow. And then I think there's an extreme. You know what I mean? I by no means shoot a light arrow, but I also don't shoot a heavy arrow. And anybody who shoots 3D archery understands pin gaps. And you take an arrow that, like, I go off of speed. I have a number in my head that I want my bows because I understand that that's where they perform the best. 290 to 295 is where I like to be. In the current setup that I'm shooting right now, I'm shooting like 293 with a 425 to 430 grain arrow. They're white-tailed deer. They're not rhinos. Shoot them in the lungs. They die. And so what happens is there's a big push right now that you need to shoot cut-on-contact broadheads, a 600 grain arrow, and because it makes everything quieter and you need momentum because kinetic energy doesn't matter anymore. All we want to talk about is momentum. Well, momentum, you still have to have speed to create momentum. And so I'm not saying that you can't shoot, or actually, I don't care what anybody shoots. You can shoot whatever you want, but there's nothing wrong. I mean, I would shoot a 590 grain arrow if I could get it to fly 290, but I'm not pulling a 100-pound bow. I mean, I'm shooting a 70-pound bow. So the issue that you run into and where you're going to see it the most is when you start shooting from elevated platforms. So if you stand on the ground and you shoot a 400 grain arrow at 40 yards, or I'm sorry, at 20 yards at 300 feet a second, and then you step back to 30 yards and you shoot the same pin, your 20-yard pin at 30 yards, your arrow should be, there should be a 2-inch difference, give or take. There should be a 2-inch difference. Do that out of a bow, shooting the same poundage with a 590 grain arrow, and tell me what your difference is at 20 and then 30 yards. I promise you it's not going to be 2 inches. And there was a video, I don't know if anybody's seen the video. Well, the two people that they had in the video shooting couldn't hit a paper plate accurately, I don't think. So I don't take a whole lot of, put a whole lot of weight in that video. Now, they take someone like Levi Morgan, who can group and show me the exact distance that arrow's moving. That's more reasonable. You know what I mean? It's because it's duplicable. But you start getting below that 240, that 250 speed range, you're going to have pin gap issues. And I had a friend of mine who shot a deer in the shoulder. He was shooting like a 380 grain arrow, and he went completely the other end. He's shooting a 660 grain arrow. Third week of season last year, calls me all mad, shot over a buck. He was like 22 foot in a tree from a saddle, shooting a 600, whatever grain arrow it was, shoots at the deer, misses over top of it. I go, how far was it? He goes, it was 25 yards. I said, well, how'd you aim for it? He said, I aimed 25 yards. Well, he's 25 foot in a tree. It's no longer this, it's this. That's why they created arc on rangefinders, to accommodate for that lift. You know what I mean? It changes it. So it's that arc and that arrow. And that's the biggest reason why I refuse to shoot anything less than 290. I don't care what the arrow weight is. I want an arrow weight that's going to work in my setup, that's going to put me in that 290 feet per second range. It works for me. You got a lot of guys who grew up shooting ASA. Chris, what's the speed on ASA? 283? Somewhere around there. They make their bows shoot 283 or 280, whatever the ASA rule is, because they shoot ASA competitions. And they do that because they already know the pin gap. They know everything. They know what their bow's going to do, at what distance, at what drop, and they know how to bracket a deer and understand where it's going to fall. The arrow's going to fall in relation to where the pins are. So it's not so much about weight for me. It's about obtaining a speed. If I was shooting a 60-pound bow and I had a 27-inch draw, my arrows are going to be shooting 290 feet a second, whether my arrow weighs 325 or 485. I want that particular speed. So, and I think it's more of a detriment pushing people to throw Lincoln logs without understanding what it's doing to their setup and their efficiency. Sure, they're creating momentum, they're creating a high kinetic energy, but what are you losing? At some point, you got to give something up. You can't have both unless you're Cam Hanes shooting a 100-pound bow with a 680 grain arrow. I mean, that's a different world. So,
Yeah, we talked a bit yesterday, and I'll refer to everyone to this podcast. Will drop with Nate Sellers yesterday. He's like an expert on setting people up with bows and stuff like that. And we actually quantified the difference between like when you lose FPS, gaining a heavier arrow and stuff like that, and like really quick stat. Like if you lose 60 FPS, assuming absolutely no air resistance, assuming you're losing velocity at the exact same rate, you're losing at least 0.07 seconds on a deer, and the speed of a deer reacting is really quick. So, you change that, and that's at a 20-yard shot. So, you replicate that to 40 yards, you're using like 0.14 seconds. So you're giving that deer a lot more reaction time at just 60 FPS. And he is right on where you're saying. He's like 260 FPS is a good place to start, and it's kind of where you want to be, and higher is good. And then the same grains, he was going 400, 460. He's like right where he wants to sit with grains personally. And he finds that that's the most versatile setup. But on from there, we've done a whole lot about anatomy, where we want to hit a deer, shot placement, where you're aiming, things like that. But one thing a lot of guys don't think about is, how do you set up a hunting scenario so that you can make an effective shot? We'll go into stopping a deer and stuff like that, but as you're going into your setup, how do you choose a setup in which you know that you're going to get a good shot opportunity at deer?
So is most everybody from PA here, or is everybody from other states?
Raise your hand if you're PA.
Okay. So PA isn't a legal baiting state. So in Ohio, we're allowed to bait. I don't live in ag country. I live in big timber, strip mine country. I manipulate all my deer with corn. I don't necessarily always hunt over the corn. No, listen, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not too proud to tell you. If I got a 170-inch deer and it's coming to a corn pile, I'll greet him. I got no problems with it. Doesn't hurt my feelings at all. I mean, because at the end of the day, no one's ever going to walk in and say, "Well, did you shoot that one over a corn pile?" And if they do, I don't care. I mean, but a lot of what stuff that I do, I manipulate them, their movements, and this can translate over to public hunting by people talk about feed trees or they talk about native browse, whether it's um, a small field or a small opening, and it's anything that you can kind of pinpoint. Okay, this deer is going here for a particular reason. So obviously, the wind is the game, and you want to put yourself in the position so that when a deer is coming through, you don't have to worry about, do I have to take a 1/4-2 shot? Do I have to think about where it's going to be? I mean, you get a deer for most people inside 30 yards, the odds of them walking directly at you and turning around on a dime and walking directly away from you is pretty much slim to none unless you're spooking them. You know what I mean? So patience, I think, is the biggest thing. I mean, I've shot a lot of deer over the years, and like I said, I'm kind of get my daughter's been doing this since she's been almost 5, a little over 4. She's never had to shoot a deer where she had to intentionally shoot the deer in the shoulder. It's just it doesn't happen. I mean, I think a lot of people panic and they say, "He's here now. I got to shoot him. This is all I got." I kind of steer away from that. I have no problem letting a deer walk away. Now, mind you, in the 30 years that I've been deer hunting, I've never had a deer walk in and only stand 1/4-2 and not give me some sort of an opportunity of it turning, quartering at some point. I'm not saying that it's sitting there for 10 seconds, but there is a point where things open up. So I think I kind of just manipulate everything and I know where they're coming from and I start backtracking them. And I was actually showing guys some of these pictures today that I have a couple deer right now where I'm getting them on two areas and I have 2 or 3 pinches that they're coming through. Well, if you set up on those pinches or you set up on those funnels, they're going to walk by you unless they see you. And whether you want to shoot them at broadside, quartering away, or however you want, the name of the game is to kind of manipulate their movement so that you can put your stance to put yourself in the best possible scenario for an ethical shot.
Yeah, and I'll give some examples for some public land guys too, like Clint Campbell. A lot of people know, host of the Truth from the Stand podcast. Big fan of like when he hunts rut scenarios. If a buck is motivated to go find does, he's often targeting them on a scrape that they're going to stop for. Like same reason that they're going to end up in a place, he's targeting them on that first area that they may stop outside of bedding before continuing on. You know, the reason they're using that bedding is eventually go to does, and so he'll target them on the scrape where they're naturally stopping. Jake Bush, really good at finding secondary food sources, kind of like you talked about native browse. That little piece that he might be going to an oak tree, but he's going to stop here and browse on some greenbrier beforehand. So kind of setting yourself up for a scenario like that is really important. Now, you have an area that you plan on that deer stopping, and it doesn't always work like that. And you know, oftentimes you say like you may have corn in relation somewhere, but you're not shooting them exactly on the corn. You're doing it like on the way to. You're cutting them off.
And even if it's cutting them off by 40 yards, you know what I mean? If you have a general vicinity of where they're coming through, like I said, I am not afraid to admit it. I've shot deer and I have shot a lot of big deer walking directly. I mean, they were inches from the corn. I mean, but like the deer my daughter shot last year, it was on its way there, but it just died before it got there.
Yeah. And it's just about creating that scenario. You know,
Right.
that's corn is just an example of how to do it. It's not like it means it's the only way, but that's something that's still really valuable to other people. And
Right.
I wanted to touch on I wanted to touch on a little bit head down versus head up, and you were talking about stopping deer.
Mhm.
And so oftentimes that plan doesn't end up working out, and you do have to maybe stop the deer, maybe you're shooting as you're walking. What's your opinion on that?
I'd much rather stop them than shoot them browsing with their head down and surprise them. that's when you're going to run into the most problems, is that head up, head down scenario. I'd much rather have a deer standing there staring, looking directly at me, turned, looking directly at me, locked in on me, than have a deer with its head down and not know it's coming at 30 yards, because they will, they will move.
So going back to what you talked about earlier, specifically with double lunging a deer, like how big of a difference is it when a deer's head is down feeding versus its head is upright, looking at you, looking away?
As far as the movement that it can make,
Yes.
it can absolutely vary by the deer, and it varies by the size of the deer. I mean, you take a button buck and you compare it to a 5-year-old deer. I mean, your target size literally almost tripled. You know what I mean? As far as mass, the actual area that you can shoot in. So, I mean, everyone's seen the videos. I mean, I've seen deer with their head down drop 12, 13 inches. That's substantial. But most of the dropping is in the front half. And there again, like I said, there's always scenarios or there's always instances, but I've also seen deer, it's like the bottom drops out of them. But at that point, they can only drop at the speed of gravity. Whenever they're pivoting their head up, they have momentum and they're moving mass this way to drop this way. And it works like a pendulum. You put someone on a teeter totter, that's the same way that the head and the shoulders work. One side's got to go up for the other side to go down.
And that's a good point too, because specifically you think about with the head going up, where that pivot happens, where that pendulum is resulting. The you have an arm here, and the base of that is not going to move, and that's kind of where the neck joins. So the majority of the movement when the head moves is going to be right behind the base. Well, guess where you're aiming? You're aiming back in the lungs, right where all that major movement is going to happen. If you're pressing up to that shoulder. So again, it's adding to that moving back, and to give someone an analogy for this. Like you'd think gravity would be just the driving force. Like how does a deer that's, the sinking motion's got to be all gravity. Well, when you're in space, like actual outer space, you'd have nothing to propel yourself off of. It's the same thing when a deer's free floating. But if you throw something behind you, you lose mass and give it momentum the other direction. It's actually going to push you the opposite direction. So everyone knows Newton's law. For every force, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Well, they're creating an opposite force upward, and that opposite force upward is driving them much faster downward, and it's specifically driving the most important part to hit downward. So, I mean, that's a scientifically proven fact, and like you said, a lot of this is not opinion; it's all fact.
Right. And the thing about it is, and it's crazy to me that this has become such a controversial topic. At the end of the day, when we go deer hunting, our main goal and our main intention is to make something dead. And so some people say, I mean, if you grew up hunting, you were told your whole life, do not shoot a deer in the guts. You shoot a deer in the guts, the death sentence. You're never going to find it. That's not true. 100% of deer will die if you shoot them in the guts. Am I telling you to go shoot a deer in the guts? Absolutely not. But what you do in the moments after that is what decides how quickly you find that deer, as in distance or ever finding the deer. There's other variables that play into it that you cannot control, other people if you're hunting public or coyotes. But you have to understand that at the end of the day, we all have the same goal. We're trying to make something dead. And the argument against shooting a deer in the guts or in the liver is unethical. Obviously, no one's intentionally doing it. But shooting a deer square in the knuckle of the shoulder is not. Well, I can tell you this, 0 deer live with a 2-inch hole going through their guts. Lots of deer live with a hole in their shoulder. And what's more painful for a deer? What's more stress? The 6 hours that it took it to die, or the 3 years that it could possibly live with a locked up shoulder because it has a broadhead stuck in it? I mean, at some point, there's got to be a little bit of give and there's got to be a little bit of take. And we need to understand that one doesn't equal the other. Because at the end of the day, no one ever walks in your house and asks you, did you shoot that deer in the guts? They don't care. Nobody cares about that. They walk in, they see the antlers on your wall, and they go, hey, man, that's a big deer. Congratulations. They don't say it. But if they shoot a deer in the shoulder, there's 2 scenarios. And if they don't get it, 1, they just don't tell you, or 2, they show you trail cam pictures of it 2 weeks later with its leg locked up or it walking through the woods hobbling. So what's more unethical? I mean, that's a decision for you individually to make. I've already made up my mind. So
So I want to open the floor for questions. Does anyone have any questions right now? We got a little bit of time left.
and I like controversial questions. Don't like it doesn't bother me. Like
Don't
I,
don't shy away from it.
yeah.
He's
Yeah.
willing to talk.
I'm not I don't get mad at all. Like I like a good debate. And I think a good debate is where people find common ground. If you don't have differences and you don't have differences of opinions, you're not gonna find any common ground anywhere because you're not gonna talk about it. You have to talk.
Hold it right up close to me. So this is more for my son. He has a smaller draw length,
Mhm.
and I mean, he's almost at 60 pounds, which isn't bad. But would you prefer cut on contact broadheads over mechanicals for him?
So what arrow weight is he shooting and what's his draw length?
It's 28.
28. I mean, it's not long. And how old is he?
He's 14.
14. And yeah, I mean you're growing. So I'm not opposed to cut on contact broadheads. I've cut a lot of cut a lot of deer. I have cut a lot of deer, but I've shot a lot of deer with a plethora of broadheads all the way back from the days when we bought the Muzzies at Walmart in a 12 pack where you'd put them together in the slots and then you'd spin them and maybe 4 of them spun true and the other ones you just throw away because they didn't spin true, to the old Thunderheads, the old Wasps. I've shot deer with Magnus Stingers. I've shot deer with other mechanicals. And by no means do I think all mechanicals are created equal, because they're not. But I will tell you this, if it was my child, how fast is he shooting?
I'm not sure. He's actually getting his bow worked on right now, so
What weight's he pulling?
it's almost 60.
Almost 60. So if it was me, if I was going to shoot a mechanical, I would shoot a 1.5 sever. But I would probably lean more towards shooting a good cut on contact broadhead, like a Magnus Stinger, a Buzz Cut, something like that. You're not going to get the blood trail that you're going to get. I don't care what anyone says. And if you do, it's going to be one-offs. It's going to be really inconsistent with cut on contact broadheads. I've shot a lot of deer with Montex since they created the solid Montec. Is it still called a Montec? It's solid. Yeah. Those, I've shot a lot of deer with those. I like those. And I think that would be a great option.
I've been using Spitfires for years.
Right. I would definitely not use a Spitfire with his setup, because between Spitfires and Grim Reapers, they do rob a lot of kinetic energy because of the way that the blades fold back. So, I mean, with him, I wouldn't. I mean, can he kill a deer with one? Absolutely. You shoot it in the middle of the lungs, yeah, you're probably not going to pass through, which again isn't the end of the world. But I mean, at that weight, at that draw length, you might as well help yourself a little bit.
So you're more thinking about conographing it and
Yeah.
getting his speed.
Yeah, I mean, but even so, okay, so let's be realistic here. Say he's a 28-inch draw. What arrow is he shooting?
I think they're the GT hunters or whatever.
The gold tip hunters.
Gold
So
tips, yeah.
if I remember correctly, those are 8.1 grains per inch, maybe somewhere around that general vicinity. And he's probably shooting a 500 or a 400 spine.
400.
400. So yeah, so he's shooting probably right around that 8.2 grains per inch. Don't quote me on that. So if 28-inch draw, he's probably shooting a 27.5-inch arrow. So 27.5-inch times 8.2 is 225 plus an insert. Those inserts on those gold tips are probably right around 15 grains. You're throwing a knock on it that's probably 10 grains. And then veins that are approximately 20 veins. 20 veins, 20 grains. So right there, you're at 370 with a 100-grain broadhead. 60 pounds, 28-inch draw, he's probably only shooting 260 at most. I would probably lean more towards a cut on contact broadhead until he starts pulling more poundage or gets a little bit longer draw length. It's just, I mean, I think that's the most rational thing. And I think a lot of people hear me say this stuff and they think that I'm anti cut on contact broadhead. I am absolutely not. When my daughter, she's 10, when she's able to pull 40 pounds, I can tell you right now it's going to be on the end of her arrow. It's going to have a Magna Stinger or a buzz cut on it because of the equipment she's using. There comes a time where you have to just be real and say, yeah, I love a big hole because big holes cause the most damage, but you also got to get there. And I think the smartest decision, if it was me, and I mean, anyone else can comment too if they think differently, I would go with a good cut on contact broadhead.
All right, thank you.
Any more really quick? Yeah, I've got another one right here. This little guy, I think he's pretty new at hunting.
Christopher?
Is he qualified to really ask a question?
I don't know.
So first, I wanted to talk about how you said to lean toward. Why are we getting the feedback? You told him to lean toward the cut on contact, and his child shooting 20 feet a second faster than my setup, which is depressing. But I just wanted to kind of.
These are round numbers. These are estimations.
I wanted you to kind of hit on for the crowd, if you would, a little bit about your background in competition archery, and maybe go into, like, you just did all these numbers off the top of your head right away. Can you kind of hit on why competing and everything helped you learn more about archery and therefore become a little better killer?
Right. So the biggest impact that changed the way that I thought about shooting was having a mentor, and it was blind luck. A friend of mine, he's in his 60s. He shot pro for Hoyt for years. He won the Triple Crown. He won the Worlds. I mean, he's ridiculous. I think two factors that made a difference with him. He has literally a set of eagle eyes. I've never seen anyone who can see as good as him. And two, his mechanics were phenomenal. And before I met him, I was an arrow slinging fool. It was bad. And he literally broke down everything that I did and rebuilt the way that I shot a bow. And he got me into shooting 3D. And so we started traveling and shooting 3D. I never shot MBO. I never shot the pro class, but I did a lot of Triple Crowns and indoor worlds and stuff. And just the amount that I was in it, I learned a lot about pin gaps and the efficiency of an arrow. Anybody who's any good at shooting 3D knows exactly what their arrow's doing at every yardage. They know that if they're going to shoot 20 yards, how far is it dropping at 22? How far is it dropping at 23? And they also know what's the difference if I'm off by 5 yards. There's nobody any good, at least, that's shooting 3D archery and is competitive, that's shooting a bow that's shooting 240 feet a second. It doesn't exist. They're not doing it. And if you watch these TAC videos online, these guys shooting these Lincoln logs at deer or these targets, and they're shooting them at 80 yards. They can't even get their sight to go down that far, and they're aiming off the bottom of the sight housing, and they're still going short of the deer. It's just you can't achieve it because of pin gaps. And if you're shooting a reasonable speed bow, when I say a reasonable speed bow, that's anything over 260. Obviously, closer to 290 is optimal for my setup. Your pin gaps change, and to the better, and your margin of error significantly decreases because you don't have to worry about, am I 5 yards off? Am I 8 yards off? Am I 3 yards off? So, I mean, shooting 3D changed the way that I looked at animals and looked at how I aimed at animals, because whenever I was shooting 3D, I was shooting a 4-pin sight. Well, you could only use 3. So you always drop the last one down, but they would always come up and they would check because you're not allowed to bracket an IBO. And if you don't know what bracketing is, there's actually a company now that makes something that you put on your sight. You know what the company? Yeah. And so there's things that you put on your sights where you can bracket a deer. And what the general concept of bracketing is that if a deer is in a certain vicinity and I use pins, well, I know if my 40 is at the top of the bottom of the belly and my 20 is at the top of its back, well, clearly, let's just do math here. It's probably somewhere between 20 and 40 yards. And my 30-yard pin's right there in the center. And if I go 5 inches high or 5 inches low, I'm probably going to kill the deer still. But we can get way more technical to get it down to 2 or 3 yards, but it's not necessary. So just understanding, I think the biggest thing that I would tell anybody is take your bow, take your 20-yard pin, shoot your 20-yard pin at 10 yards, shoot at 20 yards, shoot at 25 yards, shoot at 30 yards, and understand what it's doing and why it's doing that. And same thing with your 30-yard pin. Shoot my 30-yard pin at 20, 30, 40, even 50. Because if you shoot a single pin, you're going to get caught off guard. And I hunt with a single pin now. You're going to get caught off guard. I put my single pin on 25 yards. I'm an inch high at 20. I'm an inch low at 30. I'm 4 inches low at 40. And I know this because I messed with it. You know what I mean? I just understand what my setup's doing. I think that's the most valuable piece of information that anybody can get is familiarize with your setup. I don't care if you're shooting 320 or if you're shooting 220. Understand what your arrow is going to do. And I think that will eliminate a lot of issues down the road.
So we're running a little bit close on time here, so I'm gonna kind of rapid fire you through, and Rick's gonna kill me for going this extra section, I'm sure. But I want to go really, really, really quick through post shot. So we've gone through everything up to the anatomy, the shot, aim placement, all that stuff. Post shot, I want to get into really quick. Can we rapid fire through a few? First, judging the shot, how your shot went. What's your protocol after a shot?
Before the shot happens, I look at legs, I look at angles, and I understand where the deer is standing. Whenever I'm aiming at the deer, I'm looking at where my arrow is going to exit. After my arrow hits the deer, the first thing I notice is what did it sound like. Not all the time can I pick up exactly where my arrow hit. And many times I'm sure people have shot deer and they said, oh, I hit it perfect. They find the deer and it wasn't where they thought they hit the deer. I've been on a lot of track jobs like that. So I listen to sound. Everybody knows the pop. We talked about the pop earlier, the change in pressure. You hear that sound, you know you're inside the ribs. You're inside the diaphragm. You hear the thud, sounds like you're shooting a pumpkin. Well, you probably shot it in the grass bag. You know what I mean? You shot it in the guts. So the first thing that you need to understand is I can tell you this. Every deer that I shoot, and I know I hit it in the lungs, I pack my stuff up, I climb out of my tree, and I go find my deer. They're dead. They're dead, and usually I watch them fall, or they're dead within 100 yards if I didn't see them fall. If I shoot a deer and I'm thinking, you know what? The angle that I'm at, I might have only hit one lung, I might have hit the liver, might have exited the guts, or I just straight up shot it in the guts on accident. Biggest thing that you can do, don't go look at your arrow, don't go find blood, go home. Eat dinner, eat breakfast, eat lunch. Review everything in your head. If you want to take notes, if you want to look at a tree and say, okay, I know this deer ran here, mark that. Don't go look, just go home. I'm friends with Mike from Deer Drone Recovery. When he gets called and they say, I shot it in the guts, he's finding that deer every time. They don't not find them when they're shot in the guts because he knows they're going to be dead. The only difference is how far did they go? Did you push them? Did you walk in? Did you get a dog first and start moving them? And did you bump them 2 hours later? The biggest thing you can do is be honest with yourself. I know everybody wants to get down. They want to get their hands on their deer. They want to send pictures. They want to look at it. They want to oogle over it. Be honest with yourself. Where did I hit it? If you don't know, go home. Go home. It's not going to hurt anything. Maybe a coyote's going to get on it. That's great. I'd rather a coyote get on it in 100 yards than have to chase it 600 yards and have a coyote eat it over there. I mean, if you go look at it and you bump it, that same coyote's still going to get it. It's just going to be 600 yards away as opposed to 100. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and he's going to eat it more by the time you get there.
Right.
And find him. And then
We got a question there towards the back.
Can you hear me? All right. I just wanted to make you walk a little bit. Can you go into what somebody should do if they know they shot a deer in the shoulder?
Okay.
We've talked about that. You kind of taught me a lot about that. And I want to make sure people hear this because it's not something
That's
that
talked about.
is talked about ever.
So if you talk to any dog tracker that's worth his weight in gold, they will tell you Deer live on one lung. Deer live on one lung more so when you let them lay. If I shoot a deer square in the shoulder, if I mess up and I shoot a deer square in the shoulder, why am I waiting? I know I didn't hit it in the guts. There's two possible options. One, I hit one lung. Two, I hit both lungs. If I hit both lungs, the deer's laying there dead by the time I get out of my tree and get over to it. The other option is I hit one lung. Okay? Well, we know that a deer can live on one lung if they're not pushed. There is a scenario where pushing a deer is in your benefit. And a known one lung hit, i.e., a shoulder hit where you didn't get a lot of penetration, that's the time. If you're going to push a deer and you want to go on a walk, if you have the room, that's the time to do it. I know a lot of dog trackers who are tracking and they bump a deer. And every time they bump it, it goes a little less distance. Because every time you get them up, you get them breathing hard, you get them bleeding, you're getting stuff moving. And the more blood loss you get, because at that point, that deer is not dying from asphyxiation, it's dying from blood loss. Because they're not going to asphyxiate themselves with one lung working. You're killing them because they're losing fluid. Friend of mine's wife shot a deer in 2016 or 17. Light poundage, extreme quartering angle, hit one lung. They let it lay overnight. We walked in the next morning, bumped the deer. Deer ran 140 yards, 150 yards first time we bumped it. Bled like a stuck pig. Bumped it again next time, ran 80 yards. Bumped it again, ran 40 yards. Bumped it again, ran 20 yards into a CRP field. By the time we got up to it, it was laying there dead. There is a time to push a deer, and a one lung hit is the time to push a deer. Everyone always says, well, you shoot them in the shoulder, just let them lay, let them die. You're not helping yourself at all. You're not helping yourself at all. Because what are you waiting for? We all know that if you double lung a deer, how long does it take to die? Less than 10 seconds. You shoot a deer in the guts. Well, there's a far cry from shooting a deer in the guts and shooting a deer in the shoulder. So if you shoot a deer and you have no idea whether you hit it in front of the hip or you hit it in the shoulder, I got an optometrist for you because we need to check that.
I think we're in a pretty good place to wrap up. If anyone have any other questions at all? Well, Zach will be wandering around too. If you guys have any questions, come up, talk to him in person. He loves a good debate, as he said. So feel free to come up with a good question or something that you'd like to challenge with, and I'm sure that he'll be able to list a bunch of facts off for you too. But anything for you, Rick?
No, Dak, I'm real appreciative of your time, and I've sat here and learned a lot.
Same here, man.
Great anatomy lesson, great information regarding shot placement specifically, and one of the biggest takeaways that I have from that is I need to make sure my bow is completely tuned up and ready to go for deer season. So,
Oh, yeah.
Thanks for joining us, man.
Yeah, hey, thank you everybody for coming and listening to me ramble. So